Welcome you to my tutorial class on African historiography. In this tutorial, I'll be treating about 3 or 4 topics, namely African history and African historiography, the Eurocentric and Afrocentric perspective, sources of African history such as oral traditions, written sources, archaeology, and linguistics, then probably on colonial historiography, and lastly, Marxist perspective to African historiography. It is important to note that the writing of African history is as old as the writing of history itself. The historian of the ancient Mediterranean world and those of the medieval Islamic civilization both took the whole known world, the global society, as their frame of reference, and this included a considerable part of Africa. Okay, so Africa north of the Sahara was particularly an integral part of both civilizations, and its past was as much a concern of their historians as that of Southern Europe or Near East. So it can be said that North African history played a pivotal role in the development of African historiography. North African history continued to be part of the mainstream of the Western historical studies until the advance of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the 16th century. Also, following the Napoleon expeditions to Egypt in 1798, North Africa became again a not inconsiderable field for investigation by historians. With the growth of European colonial powers in North Africa, after a French conquest of Algeria in 1830 and the British occupation of Egypt in 1882, a European colonialist standpoint came to dominate the writings of African history, not just North Africa. All right, the European, in a way to legitimize the essence of European colonialism, employed and recruited and commissioned anthropologists, historians, sociologists, and various intelligentsias to rewrite the history of Africa in a way that was highly denigrating, that was subjugative, and relegating Africa to the dustbin of history. And I'm going to come up with a few of the Eurocentric perspective. So, however, the point is by the 1930s, the modernist movement in Islam, the growth of European style education in North African colonies, and the rise of North African nationalist movement also spread to other parts of European colonies, combining to produce indigenous schools of historians, writing in French and English as well as in Arabic, to restore the proper balance to African historical studies. And these are some of the issues that we'll be highlighting in the course of this tutorial. So I'll be going sharply into the various perspectives, the Eurocentric perspective and also the Afrocentric perspective. By the 18th century, it would seem that tropical Africa was getting its due share of attention from European historians and anthropologists and scholars. It was now possible, for example, to use the earlier essentially descriptive writers like Leo Africanus and Diapers as historical sources, to legitimize, the European Eurocentric historiographies, all right, and perspective about Africa. By the 19th century, the European colonialists had popularized the idea about Africa as a place of darkness, a place of underdevelopment without history or without motion. And this was written as a source of inspiration for the Europeans to dominate Africa and expropriate the resources following the aftermath of the Berlin Conference. And this was demonstrated in the works of various Europeans. For instance, W.F. Hegel, 1770 to 1831, who stated in his position, that Africa was a place of barbarism, all right, a place that was uncivilized and without motion. Philosophy of history, which contains such statements as that Africa is not a historical continent. Hegel shows that there was neither no change nor development in Africa, and that its Negro people were capable of neither development nor education. Although Hegel's direct influence on the elaboration of African history may have been small, the view he represented became part of the historical orthodoxy of the 19th century, and is not without its adherent or even no its proponent today. That's why you have many Eurocentric accounts that continues to distort African history. So one of the most recent Eurocentric perspective was the one by Regius, the professor of modern history at Oxford University, who once declared that perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. Further to state that, please do not misunderstand me. I do not deny that men existed even in dark countries and dark centuries, nor that they had political life and culture. Interesting to sociologists and anthropologists, okay, but history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement and purposive movement too. It is not a mere phantasmagoria of changing shapes and costumes, of battles and conquests, dynasties and usurpations, social forms and social disintegration. This was the encapsulation of a professor of Oxford, and a biased and Eurocentric perspective about African historiography or an African history. Went to argue that history, or rather the study of history, has a purpose. We study it in order to discover how we have come to be where we are, and that the present world is so dominated by Western European ideas, techniques, and values that for the last 5 centuries, at least, insofar as the history of the world has significance, it is only European history that counts. He therefore concluded that we cannot therefore afford to amuse ourselves with unrewarding the unrewarding gyration of barbarous tribes in pictures but irrelevant corners of the globe. So these are even more subtle, criticism of African history and African historiography. So many other European historians and anthropologists have even gone further, to describe the people in Africa as half human and half beast who could never discern or attempt to preserve any written record about their circle of motionlessness. Europeans had equated the development of African historiography, or the history, with the coming of European and with the advent of literacy or establishment of Western education, neglecting the fact that several modes of historical reconstruction had existed in Africa before the advent of the Europeans, before the incursion of the European to Africa, such as Arabic script and writings, and oral traditions and other sources, such as linguistics, that I'm going to emphasize. Some of the early historians, some of the early European travelers who were genuinely interested in Africa had encountered some of these ancient manuscripts written in Arabic texts, and some of them preserved in various kinds of repositories, oral information preserved in different forms in Africa, and they had used them to document several aspects of Africa, especially oral traditions, and note on such antiquities as they saw. So this literature were produced by these Africanist explorers, in immense proportion, and which continues to shape Europe's Afrocentric accounts, in spite of the the prevalence of Eurocentric perspective during the 19th century. Matters were made worse for the study of African history by the emergence at about the time when in Germany, the concept of the historian's craft, in which it became less a branch of literature, was popularized in Germany. All right, giving credence to the Eurocentric perspective, which continued to denigrate Africa and its historical trajectory. For the European history, of course, these were predominantly written sources, and in this context, these were accounts that had to be justified, that were to be subjected to scientific experiments, theories, and concept of European accounts, undermining the indigenous peculiarities. And the matter was debated in the early 19th century, in Europe and in Germany, as to what constitutes history. All right, and so the conclusion was that history only begins when men take to writing. So whatever you have as historical record is of no use without documentation. The implication of this in European accounts is that the past of Africa before the onset of European imperialism is on ascertained, cannot be ascertained, and Africa's past before the coming of the Europeans could not be reconstructed, and the reconstruction of African history would only begin when the Europeans step their foot on Africa, and when they were able to obtain materials, remains, and even linguistic evidence, all right, to reconcile the primitive customs, and such things that were of no significance to the global society. So these were some of the prejudice. All right. So, but to demonstrate the African art history, a new strand or a new cream of scholars, whether among the Europeans and even Africans, emerged in the early 20th century. All right, who use various means and techniques and mechanisms such as archaeology, linguistics, all right, and ethnography to demonstrate the richness of African historiography. And I'll turn to the various sources of history in this dimension. So this will be used to deconstruct some of the perspectives of Eurocentric accounts. By the mid 20th century, Africanist historians emerged from various parts of Africa, the colonial world, in Nigeria, in Gold Coast, in Dar es Salaam. All right, especially starting from University of Ibadan and Dar es Salaam, to challenge some of these European, the domination of African history by Eurocentric perspectives. All right, this actually marked the beginning of the decolonization, the epistemic decolonization in African history. Concept of decoloniality suggests the process of delinking from established Eurocentric knowledge, hierarchies, and models, which had characterized the narration of African history. Outline Africanist thinkers and scholars of decoloniality emerge, convinced that the problems associated with Eurocentric accounts were associated with the colonial ambition of the legitimizing indigenous cultures and institutions in Africa as a way to perpetuate colonial structures and colonial values in the in African society. And efforts were made, as I'm going to demonstrate, using various sources, various approaches to legitimize and to show the richness and the usefulness of African history in everyday societal realities. Realizing that oral tradition was a viable and the oldest source of historical findings, which even the Europeans would not dispute. The early or the emergent Africanist historians deployed oral traditions as a means to also delegitimize Eurocentric perspective in African history. Oral tradition has been discussed by many scholars, and few of their definitions will be used, especially the one by Jan Vansina, who opined that the expression oral traditions apply both to a process and its products. The products are oral messages based on previous oral messages, at least from a generation apart. So the process is the transmission of such messages by words of mouth over time until the disappearance of the message. Jan Van Sina therefore defines oral tradition as verbal testimonies which are reported statements concerning the past. And this was further corroborated by David Enigin, who who discusses that oral traditions refer to that corpus of orally transmitted material which addresses itself specifically to recounting the past. And John Tosh, another expert in historiography, sees oral tradition as the narrative and description of people and events in the past which have been handed down by words of mouth over several generations. And other scholars indeed agree, such as E.J. Alagua, who discloses that oral traditions are in theory testimonies concerning the past transmitted from one person to another over time. And accordingly, the person who recounts a tradition in the present was not usually an actor or eyewitness in the past. So, from the definitions given, all right, it can be said that oral tradition is the body of information that has been preserved in a community or family and handed down from one generation to another. It can also be pointed out that oral tradition helps to trace the history of a people through many generations, all right, thus serving as a valuable source of historical reconstruction. And this played out, in the early 20th century, where Africanist scholars like Kenneth Owuka Dike at the University of Ibadan, J.F. Adeajayi, and other eminent Africanist historians deployed oral traditions to demonstrate the richness of African historiography and to demonstrate, to debunk, and to refute some of the Eurocentric views about Africa as a place of darkness and primitive customs. So it is noteworthy that owing to the usefulness of oral tradition, many African states and society in the past had formal institutions or even appointed official historians who reenacted their history and culture at important ceremonies such as festivals, burials, and the installation of kings and so on. So examples of such officials include the Arokin of Old Oyo Empire, the Yobe in the ancient Benin Kingdom, and the griots, in Senegal. These were usually carefully trained officials of the state, all right, who were saddled with the responsibility of preserving the historical realities of the people in the society. And this will further be explained subsequently. Stressing that Africa had rich history, all right, and refuting some of the Eurocentric accounts, the emergent Africanist historians like K.O.D.K. used several sources of oral traditions to demonstrate that Africa had rich and viable history. Various sources of oral traditions, which include myths, legends, proverbs, and oral literature. And we have also praise names, folklores, folktale, riddles, and so on. So, as I've mentioned, it is important to note that it is these sources that aided the preservation of oral traditions in the past, which means that without them, the past cannot be recaptured or even in its fragmentary state. And the early Africanist historians like Kenneth Dike and Adeajayi deployed this. For instance, in Dike's work, Trade and Politics in the Niger Delta, all right, he demonstrated the richness of oral traditions using some of these materials. Myths, for instance, all right, helped him, in spite of its frailties and limitations, helped him to recount and to reanalyze, assemble the history, not just the history of trade, but the historical experience and trajectory of the people of the Niger Delta as other Africanist historians also did during the time. We have legend. Okay, you have also have legend, which is also a story or group of stories handed down through popular oral traditions, usually consisting of an exaggerated or reliable account of some actually or possibly historical persons or events. So legends are sometimes distinguished from myths in that they concern human beings rather than gods. All right, and sometimes because that they have some sort of historical basis, whereas myths do not. All right, but these distinctions are difficult to maintain consistently. Expect it's only when you are an expert that you'll be able to differentiate between them. So the term in Europe was usually applied to account of saints' life and all of these stuffs. But the point I'm trying to make to say is that both these sources helped lay the foundation in the reconstruction of Africa's past, and which refuted most of the Eurocentric beliefs and assertions which I've already analyzed at the beginning. All right. So I also there's also proverbs. All right, proverbs which are also involved include maxims of thought, distillations or approximation of more detailed philosophy, mostly extracted from historical or religious experiences of the people. All right, so they helped in delegitimizing most of these Eurocentric biases and prejudice. Proverbs are expressed in virtually all African languages, you understand, and they involve wise sayings, all right, compressed in form but richer in depth, and this helped to support most of the claims of African. And as we speak to date, all of these sources, including folktale, which uh, which is quite also very rich, continues to maintain or retain its usefulness in the reconstruction of Africans. So oral literature is one of them, all right. And I think I've mentioned I was praise poems, dance, festivals. These are some of the chants, and poetry. All right, these are some of the materials, all right, used by then the pioneer of African historiography at Ibadan. All right, tradition and oral history. So there is a distinction between oral tradition and oral history. All right, it's been observed that the terms oral tradition and oral history have been often mistaken for each other, and they are used interchangeably. So of course this is quite understandable, all right, because of the similarity. So according to the analysis of E.J. Alagua, oral traditions are testimonies concerning the past transmitted from one person to another through time. All right, and accordingly, the person who recount the traditions in the past was not an actor or eyewitness. I think I've mentioned that before. All right, so oral history, the person who recount them are themselves are not themselves are actors, all right, or eyewitness accounts. From the foregoing, it can be said that oral tradition is indeed older than oral history. All right, that's the point I'm trying to emphasize. And oral tradition is older than the generation recounting it, while oral history is a contemporary event in which the person recounting them are participants. So all of these were distilled in the middle of the 20th century, all right, in trying to redefine the approaches to African historiography, in the 20th century.
Okay.
Okay.
So I should come down.
Accounts are basically defined as a means by which historical events are documented in writing and concrete form. No written or printed information at the disposal of the historians, after oral traditions. They include archival materials, private papers of outstanding individuals in the society, official government papers, diaries, all of which have come to be regarded as primary source material, for the same reason for which oral traditions are also classified. Other materials in these categories include journal articles, published text, magazines, and even documentary government papers. But these are regarded as non no are regarded not as primary but secondary source material because they represent the synthesis, the evaluations, and sometimes reinterpretation of existing material source material. Okay, basis of this that Eurocentric writers considered it arguable that Africa had no form of historical consciousness before the advent of the Europeans. Claims that Africans do not have history is also very, very weak in the context of the fact that even when the Europeans argue that written sources should be the basis upon which a society could be regarded to have developed, all right, in Africa before the advent of the Europeans, Arabic scripts and accounts were used by various towns and kingdoms to record or to preserve their historical memories. The Arabic account constitute the works of Arab writers, all right, and the Arab writers were majorly merchants, and their main area of operation and influence was North Africa and some parts of northern fringes up to West Africa. So in most of the encounters the Arabs and the North African merchant had with Africa, so Islamic or Arabic literacy had been introduced to the extent that this Arabic literacy produced the earliest form of documentation on African history. The Arab merchants and traders visited African traders as evangelists of Islam. They gained convert and also taught some of their adherents to write in Arabic. So the works of Arab writers greatly influenced historical writings in Africa. To be realistic, the extent to which the regions of Africa adopted or adapted to Islamic traditions of historiography has differed tremendously. North Africa operated in the full tradition of the rest of the Islamic world, of which it was the western extremity. All right, so its historians, then especially those of the Maghreb, developed regional varieties of the Islamic tradition while keeping in touch with the central tradition as much as it was practicable. So many Islamic script, Arabic script had become widespread in West Africa, especially in the Sahel region, in Borno Empire, in Hausa State, in Niger, in Mali, in Timbuktu, and different parts of West Africa. They had popularized the use of Arabic writing in documenting their historical accounts or their historical events. In Western Sudan, an indigenous community of Islamic scholars gradually developed at important centers such as Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao. All right, this was after the destruction of the Songhai Empire by the Moroccan forces at the Battle of Tondibi in 1591, and these scholars became quite independent of external influence. They created a historiography in the Islamic mode, but comprising the African oral traditions. So most of the oral traditions collected from Africans were documented in Arabic scripts, and such were some of the two major historical works of the Western Sudan, the Gaubez Tarika, and Al Fatah, compiled from about 1519 to 1664, and the Timbuktu Genebese Tariq, all right, titled Sudan of Al Sadi, which was published in 1596. All of these were evidence to show that Africa, before the advent of the Europeans, before the commencement of colonialism, had a rich history and they had their own ways and means of preserving them. So, and I will now turn to other sources such as archaeology and linguistics now. Apart from Arabic texts, archaeology forms, by the beginning of the 20th century or by the middle of the 20th century, archaeology formed a major source of historical research in the reconstruction and interpretation of past events and formed part of primary sources of data in African history. Archaeology is the study of material remains, of people themselves, their dwellings, their caves, their fortification used for protection. All right, archaeology, in a broader sense, is a scientific study of the remnants of the past, such as ancient sites, relics, monuments, coins, currency, inscriptions, and other artifacts which can be excavated, and can help in reconstructing history in a most plausible manner. So this, by the middle of the 20th century, when the field of African historiography started in Ibadan and later Dar es Salaam and ABU, archaeology was a critical component of the sources of African history. Archaeology helps with the research into the prehistoric studies, and the aim of this was to basically for people to determine the longevity of a particular object, or maybe a skull was excavated from the ground. All right, so subjecting it to archaeology will help to ascertain the time when that object was produced, the people who produced them, what materials or technologies were used in producing them. And this helped a great deal in trying to legitimize African historiography, to justify the claims of the Africanists, as many uh, archaeological findings were carried out. So the techniques employed by archaeologists, especially in the identification of location sites, are the area photography, reconnaissance, survey, and geophysical survey. All right, so this helps them. For area photography, they have to use something similar to drones. Then reconnaissance, which the mapping, all right, and geophysical survey, which help them to know where a particular object has been buried. All right, whether it's ancient city or monument or even human skeletons. So this helped archaeology, and these archaeological relics or artifacts were subjected to radiocarbon datings, radiocarbon analysis, which is a scientific means of determining the characteristics of a particular artifact. So history tends to, African history, African historians relied essentially on archaeology to legitimize their claims about the richness of African history, through most of the archaeological research that was done in Benin, in Ife, in Igbo, all right, in Taruga, Dahama, in Bago, and Uganda, in old Zimbabwe, and a few places. A major flaw of archaeology as a source of historical writing is that information derived from it are often not uniform. And this is because information available are sometimes accidentally discovered, either in the course of farming or in the course of digging, all right, or in the course of extractive activities that archaeological relics or artifacts are located. And most often in turns it leads to generalization, and often which doesn't reflect the events that are taking place in restricted areas. This archaeology remains a valuable source of historical research. It's provided a reliable materials for early or pioneer Africanist historians who deconstructed European prejudice about Africa. Again, another source of historical research deployed during the 20th century, and which continues to retain its usefulness in historical scholarship, is linguistics. Linguistics is the scientific study of language and its structure, or the systematic study of human language. So the use of linguistics helped enabled Africanist historians in the 20th century to understand the interrelations between African cultures, customs, and traditions, and how people had lived, all right, and were related with each other in the past. The use of glottochronology, a branch of lexicostatistics, and a study of the rate which language change, are very valuable for historical research, and they have been useful in historical reconstruction, as evident, in its role in analyzing vocabularies, grammatical forms, and social change of a given language, which has also helped to understand the evolution of human society. Right. So linguistics became a historical source in Africa due to the overlap of languages. All right. T. Obenga further opined that its influence is mainly a matter of comparative and historical linguistics. So the method of using glottochronology and lexical statistics and other methods, help historians in situating African history in comparative dimension. So it helps to understand how people in particular location speak certain language, and how those language shapes existential realities or cultural practices of people. Of historical linguistics lies not so much in finding a common pre-dialectical languages as in appreciating the overall linguistics spread of, of different and related languages. So a language, for instance, is seldom enclosed within a clearly defined space, but most commonly overflows its own area by making relationship between different across line. Basically, so a common language in linguistics, can flow. For instance, among the Yoruba, it's been demonstrated how certain words, all right, were used to determine or ascertain the level of connection. For instance, between the Yorubas and the Igala, all right, between the Igbos and the Yorubas, all right, in the past, between Benin and the Yorubas, for example. Linguistics helped historians to understand that there were intergroup relations forged by language in the past. So linguistics have classified the various African languages into groups according to how closely related they are to each other or to one another. And it is believed that most of these languages come from a common, parentage, proto-language, for instance. Through linguistics, that the linguistic classification of language, such as the Niger Congo, which involves the various West African states, the Mande, the Volta, Kwa, and the Proto-Bantu, all right, who later migrated and dominated southern and eastern Southeast Africa zone, that historians were able to establish that people, from these lines, had interactions with one another in prehistoric time. The same thing applies to the Nilo-Saharan, Saharan Nilotic and Songaic, language, the Khoisan, language, and Afro-Asiatic groups. So linguistics has helped to demonstrate the connection between African people, which demonstrated also the values and the richness of African history. Important to acknowledge that documenting the history of African people, the pre-literate African society, through oral traditions, linguistics, archaeology, and other available sources, is not was not a, well, is not an easy task. The pioneer historians in Africa, all right, had to contend with the challenges of, crafting and assembling a series of materials, to reconstruct the past. This is because the historian's craft in interpretation and reconstruction is often affected by echoes and distortions of oral traditions in human repositories, and also some of the limitations associated with the various sources that we have highlighted, whether linguistics or whether archaeology. All right. So these echoes and feedback, according to D.P. Enigin, often occurs mostly in oral traditions, when extraneous materials, usually from secondary sources, is incorporated into the traditions. All right, or where exaggerations, all right, and other prejudice are also included in oral history, oral tradition. So therefore, it means that the practice of oral history itself is based on certain assumption. It is often assumed that the past event can be gathered from available oral traditions and from testimonies of people living in the present. So it is also assumed that the practice of gathering people's testimonies and interpreting them should be based on the nature of memory, narrative, identity, performance, subjectivity, and power. So that made it quite Herculean for historians who are trying to reconstruct the past. Basically, so because the historians will have to contend with the challenges of merging and assembling various materials and synthesizing that. So because it is difficult to capture the past of human society, especially the pre-literate African society, in myths or legends or stories, all right, which are stored in either human repositories in a memory or preserved in proverbs or songs or even through archaeology or linguistics. So there is also the question or controversy as to whether the past actually exists, as the Eurocentric scholars have actually contended. So, and this is key for you to understand that historical reconstruction requires assembling masses of verifiable facts and claims and arranging them based on a series of events, generally a chronological one or a set of such. So, as Otomawick has noted, the events of the past themselves do not constitute history, yet historians have to reconstruct the past sequentially based on verifiable evidence. All right, and I think it's essential to extrapolating knowledgeably from oral history of pre-literate African society involves critical evaluation and historians' ability to distinguish, to differentiate between historical facts, conjectures, and verifiable claims. All right, so it is therefore important for the historians to be sufficiently grounded in historical understanding to bring reliable historical analysis to bear in trying to write the history of pre-literate African society as the pioneer historians at Ibadan did. And what is fundamental, what is required is a mastery of what Frederick needs describe as critical history. All right, and what Gordon Craig has explained as the ability, after painful inquiry and sober judgment, to determine what part of oral accounts verifiably correspond with general history. So, with all of this, African history is rich, is quite valuable. All right, and African historiography has been proven right by historians all over the world who have used these sources, archaeology, linguistics, paleontology. They have used oral tradition, oral history to document African history and demonstrate the richness of African historiography. Let me just make a sense about the topic on Marxist perspective, all right, in the writing of history. The Marxist method, which is essentially historical and for which history is the collective consciousness or in actions, lays greater emphasis on the productive forces and production relations, all right, on praxis and norms, while the structuralist method aims at unveiling the unconscious but logical mechanisms and coherent ensembles which frame the underlying, all right, action of the mind of society. So the Marxist approach, unlike the other forms of approach to African historiography, emphasize the productive relations of production as the means through which society can be understood. All right, unlike the Eurocentric accounts, which emphasize a mythic hypothesis, which emphasize the use of European techniques and theories and concepts, all right, to the unraveling of African history. The Marxist approach sees the history of every human society as a product of class struggle, all right, which is explained in terms of the productive relations of production in society. That the economic basis is the ultimate means through which the society should be understood. That is why you see here Marx is saying that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. All right, so many Marxists have tried to define history or to analyze history from the Marxist approach using the class dimension. So the class dimension is one of the key approach which Marxists use in understanding the past. They believe that all history is a history of tension and conflict between social classes, between the haves and the have-nots, between the oppressor and the oppressed, the government and the governed. All right, that is why Michel Foucault will say history is not a predictable mechanism, but the most problematic site of often random struggles, viciously articulated in a cruel world of servant-masters relationship, landlord-tenant, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the oppressor and the oppressed, the government and the governed relationship. So Marxists, try to understand society through the economic paradigm model. That the economic, lens provides a more viable and more insightful approach to understanding society. The idea of exploitation, all right, is the underlying characteristics of Marxist approach in historiography.